And we're back. Now, the Ecoclema and the Machina, I have pictures loaded up on D2L of what those looked like, so make sure you take a look at those. I also have pictures of all of these theater architectural advancements that I'm going to talk about. Those are also loaded up on D2L, so you should take a look at them. In the beginning, here in the classical era under theater architecture, this was really just sort of a big circle. It was leveled out, and there was a temple next to it. There's usually called a timel, which is an altar in the center of that circle. And then people sort of sat either on carved out areas of the hill beside it or on wooden bleachers. Originally they used a lot of wooden bleachers, but then at one point in time wooden bleachers collapsed and killed thousands of people, and they thought it was a bad idea. So they started carving seats into the hillside. And we get to the level by the end of the classical era where we actually have a scene building somewhere between 465 and 458 BC that was introduced. So it's at the end of at the back of the circle. So the audience is in front. There's a circle, and then behind the circle is a building there for the actors to act in front of. And then a second story was introduced called the Epicenium, and that's Episcenium. The skene is Skene. So the scene building was not really made of stone until around the last quarter of the 5th century, which would put it 421 to 415-ish BC. And we start to see the appearance of the Parascenia, Parascenia, which are side sections, additions to that scene building, and the Proskene, which is the sort of a jutting area out in front of the scene building itself, which is where we get the word proscenium from. Originally, the acting area, the logium, was the area right in front of the scene, this was the ground, where they would act. Once you made a proscenium, or a proskene, that jutted out, it left for a second acting area. Well, it was a top acting area, it was above acting area, so it was called the theologium, and that is where gods would act, theo meaning god or deity. So it created two different acting areas. The logium is Logium, and that is the staging area where they would act, the playing space. All right. Also around this time, they started building these smaller sort of square structures, and they had them in Rome as well, so we'll come across them in Rome also. But they're just square structures with a roof and columns holding it up. These were actually, they were called odiums, or O-D-E-I-O-N, or odiums, O-D-E-U-M. And those were usually used for recitations, poetry recitation, or reading a play, or musical entertainments. Seated about 1,500 people or so, not the big amphitheaters that we're talking about normally, but they existed and they were important as far as theater history is concerned. All right, so by the end of this classical era, we start to see the basic general footprint of what we know as a Greek theater emerge. Most of it's wood, though. The scene building becomes made of stone by the end of that, but the Parascenia are made of stone with a wooden foundation, and the Proskenium is still made of wood by the end of the classical era. Then we move into the Lycurgus area. Now, Lycurgus was a minister of finance in Athens between like 338 and 326 BC. And he decided to make these changes to the theater. So that we therefore call it the Lycurgus theater era. The auditorium was made of stone, so now all of those benches and bleachers out there are all stone. And the other major is it probably is a reproduction in stone of the outline of the original theater. So proscenium is still theoretically made of wood by the end of Lycurgus theater. Once we get to the Hellenistic theater, now we start to see everything finally being made of stone, the proscenium included. And the there were little openings called thyromata. Instead of just doors in the epicenium, the second floor, they didn't have doorways up there, they just had openings. They were called thyromata. And that was characteristic of Hellenistic theaters. So if you see a picture of a theater and it's 2 stories, the roof of the proscenium sort of breaking the first and second story off, and then the second story has these sort of arch-type openings, those are thyromata, and that's characteristic of Hellenistic theater. So we're in the Neronian theater. Now, the Neronian theater, meaning that Nero had his hand in this. This is after Greece was taken over by Rome and became one of its city-states, roughly around 126 BC or so. But they erect a stage in front of the scene building. So now there is a literal stage instead of just a floor acting space, but an actual stage here, and then the theologium still on top of the proscenium. And that stage, however, gives us another sort of a frontal facade area known as the hyposcenium, or the hyposkene. Hyposkene. Okay, and this is an opening. The openings here remain the same as far as the episkene is concerned, but we also have an area between where the ends of the auditorium, what's called the theatron, or seeing place in Greek, where they stop and the scene building begins. There's doors there that are openings, and these are called proskene, Proskene. I'm sorry, not proskene. There's called parados, Parados. You can probably try to remember it by, it's a pair of doors between on either side of the auditorium and the scheme building. All right, so that is the basic structure of all of those areas. Those appeared more along the lines actually in the Hellenistic era, but they're very visible and functional in the Neronian era. The Phaedrus Theater, these alterations were made by Phaedrus, the governor of Attica. They had a gutter between the end of the orchestra area, the circle, and the front row of the audience area, the theatron. He had a gutter there, and what he ended up doing is he filled that up with trash, packed it down, filled it with, covered it with dirt, and then they put marble all over the floor of the orchestra area. Timel has still been in the center, hasn't changed. All right. The stage is rebuilt and lowered, so the hyposkene was adorned by a frieze here because it's very Roman, but it's also shorter than it had been in the past. That's really about the only changes you need to know with regards to that era. So that takes care of theater architecture and finishes us up for Greek theater. Moving on now to Roman theater.